Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine, if you will, opening up a foundational text, a scripture that, is revered by billions,
Right.
and discovering that inside its pages, there's a detailed, self-contained instruction manual,
Mm.
a manual for how the text itself is meant to be studied and understood and applied.
And we're not talking about external tradition or some later commentary.
Exactly. Not at all. We're talking about a guide that's within the guide. It's explicitly outlining the methodology, the ultimate authority structure, and even the exact mindset you need for the right interpretation.
And that concept, this idea of an integrated, self-sufficient study guide, that is precisely what we are exploring today.
Yeah.
Our source material has provided this really intense, highly specialized reading of Surah Anam, which is chapter 6 of the Quran,
Okay.
specifically focusing on verses 68 through 150. And this isn't, a conventional theological summary.
It's not just what does it say.
No, it's an extraction of 5 fundamental principles that the source claims are directly embedded right there in the passages. You can think of them as the text's own intellectual guardrails.
Guardrails, I like that.
Yeah, designed as a kind of shortcut to a genuine, distortion-free understanding.
So our mission today is, well, it's ambitious. We are moving past the common question of what the scripture says, and we're diving into the more radical question of how the scripture says we should approach it. We want to unpack these 5 core guidelines: the methodology, the authority, the logic, the focal point, and the application, to really get at the integrated framework the source material presents to the learner.
And the need for this framework, at least according to the source, comes from this necessity of moving beyond just information overload.
And all the assumptions we inherit, right?
Exactly, the crushing weight of inherited assumptions. The source actually calls this entire segment of Surah Anam the enlightening passage.
The enlightening passage.
Exactly. And it establishes the tone immediately by offering this really actionable, almost confrontational instruction right at the very beginning.
That's verse 68, isn't it? The one about people who mock the messages?
That's the one.
It says that when you encounter people like that, the directive is crystal clear. Turn away from them until they move on to a different hadith.
It sets up an immediate boundary.
Yeah.
It distinguishes the messages from these external, potentially distracting or, corrupting conversations.
Right.
Which are referred to right there as hadith.
Right.
But just as important is the call for personal, deep intellectual engagement. Look at verse 80.
My sustainer encompasses all things with knowledge. Will you not then reflect?
See, that juxtaposition is so powerful. On one hand, you have this physical removal from distraction,
Turn away from them?
and on the other, an intellectual mandate for deep, knowledgeable thought.
It tells the learner you have to be protected from the external noise, but you also have to actively and, deeply engage with the internal truth.
Indeed. And the source organizes this demanding engagement into the 5 fundamental principles we're about to explore. So let's start with the one that dictates the whole intellectual infrastructure of the process.
Okay.
The principle of holistic study, the integrated whole.
This moves right away to address what is, the foundational problem of scriptural interpretation everywhere, which is pulling verses out of context.
Precisely. Core Guideline 1 mandates studying the Quran holistically. You have to view it as one interconnected whole.
So not a collection of individual rules.
Not at all. The source argues that the book is its own best explainer. This is what it calls the Quranic process of interactive explanation, where every single verse has to be cross-referenced, where, later verses clarify earlier ones, and where the totality of the message shapes the meaning of its individual parts. It's an internal, self-sufficient system.
Wait, let me just push back on this a little bit, because that sounds simple, but the implications are radical.
They are.
If the text explains itself, then any attempt to interpret a single verse based on some outside authority or commentary is, well, it's fundamentally breaking the method prescribed by the text itself. That is a massive critique of, centuries of accumulated religious scholarship.
Oh, the source material is very aware of that. It explicitly calls this the problem of partiality. It suggests that a quick, detached, and fragmented approach, just reading a single verse or a chapter in isolation, it actually forces the reader to look for outside religious authorities.
Why? Why does it force them?
Because the verse, when you take it alone, it doesn't make sense. So the reader panics, and they search outside for the missing context. They fail to realize that the book already contains the full context. They didn't read enough of it.
So seeking external help isn't just unnecessary in this view, it's actually evidence that the reader has already failed at the prescribed internal method.
And we find the textual evidence for this holistic demand right there in the surah. The source highlights this repeated use of the expression, who do not acknowledge the end.
The end, okay.
Yeah, you see it in verses like 113 and 150. And this is a really crucial pivot point in the source material's entire interpretation.
This is where we need to slow down a bit.
Yeah.
Because for our listener, the N is usually translated as ahira, right? Which often means the afterlife or the day of judgment. The source material is claiming a linguistic shift here, suggesting it means the whole or the holistic meaning. How does the source justify interpreting ahira, not just, temporally, but methodologically?
Well, the justification lies in the functional definition. If you only interpret ahira as some future event, the concept of accountability just stays static. It's something that happens later.
Right.
But the source argues that the text is criticizing a lack of intellectual coherence right now, in the present. So the end means the completion, the finality, or the totality of the message. To acknowledge the whole is to accept that the entire scripture is one single coherent system of truth.
I see.
So, when the source reads, who do not acknowledge the end, it's interpreting that as a criticism of those who fail to see the coherence of the scripture as a whole. They're treating it like a disconnected series of commands.
That completely reframes the transgression, doesn't it?
It does.
It's not just a lack of faith in the future, but a fundamental failure in your methodology in the present. The implication is that if you approach the text partially, your mind will naturally incline thereto, meaning you'll gravitate towards these external doctrines or misinterpretations that, they just align with your fragmented understanding.
And the text preempts this search for external context by stating the internal solution. Let's see, in their verse 114, he it is who has sent down unto you the book, explained in detail.
Explained in detail.
That phrase is a declarative statement of textual self-sufficiency. If it is explained in detail, well, the explanation must be within the details, not outside of them. The integrity of the whole guarantees the clarity of the parts.
And this commitment to the one whole doesn't just apply internally to the Quran, does it? I think the source argues this holistic approach extends to other historical scriptures as well.
Absolutely. I mean, recognizing the oneness of the source, the divine logically requires recognizing the oneness of the message throughout history.
It has to be consistent.
It has to be. The source states that this holistic approach helps the learner recognize the Quran not as some isolated event, but as a continuation of previous scriptures, acknowledging all of them as one book, a continuous evolving message. Fragmentation is the enemy of continuity.
Let's tie this core guideline back to the practical and spiritual application mentioned in the source material, the concept of salat in verse 92. The source links this holistic mindset directly to spiritual practice. It notes that those who acknowledge the whole protect their communication or salat with God's messages from deviation.
And this is another pivotal redefinition. If we're going to understand the source material's framework, we have to grasp that salat, in this specific context, is defined not merely as a ritual prayer with, specific physical movements.
Which is how it's almost always understood.
Almost always. Here, it's defined as a continuous connection to the divine messages. It's the constant, uninterrupted dialogue between the reader and the text, a dialogue that's maintained by the holistic methodology.
I see. So if you deviate from the whole, you introduce noise or external concepts that break that connection.
You break the signal. So protecting your salat means protecting the integrity of your continuous engagement with the coherent divine message.
It is the ultimate protective methodology. By keeping the whole in view, the communication, your persistent link to the divine remains pure and protected from fragmentation and external pollution. It requires constant, active engagement, not just mechanical repetition. That is core principle 1, the internal architecture.
That is a really profound foundation. Now, if the first principle is about how to read the text
holistically, then the second principle is an incredibly aggressive statement about what must be excluded from the reading process. And this immediately introduces conflict and friction and, sectarian debate. We're moving to section 2. Rejecting external authorities, the challenge to hadith.
This is where the source material is, well, undeniably controversial and direct. Core Guideline 2 is an explicit instruction to reject human commentaries, known as hadiths, as authorities that can stand equal to the Quran.
So it's not just that they're secondary.
No, the source argues these secondary texts are not merely supplemental. They are functionally illegitimate co-judges.
The source material goes far beyond just rejecting their authority, though. It argues that Suriname actually predicts their invention. I mean, that is a very strong claim. How does the source build the case that this passage graphically predicts the rise of hadith as an illegitimate co-authority?
The argument really centers on two verses, 112 and 68, which are read as a single cohesive warning. The source claims that verse 1 and 12 identifies the precise intellectual forces that would emerge to corrupt the message. It states, "And thus, we have appointed to every prophet and enemy devils from humans and invisibles, inspiring one another with decorative speech as delusion."
Decorative speech. So the enemy of the prophet, according to this very specific interpretation, is the force that inspires this decorative speech that leads to delusion. And the source is linking decorative speech directly to the contents of hadith.
That link is made completely explicit. The source claims the designation of hadith as devil's inspiration is severe because it highlights the fundamental intellectual difference between the two sources.
Okay, what's that difference?
Well, the Quran, as we just noted, is self-explanatory, detailed, and aimed at unity. Verse 153 calls it the straight path. Hadith, in this view, is described as satanic because it acts as a mechanism of division and deviation. It takes that straight path and it bends it. It misleads its followers and it fragments the cohesive message.
I have to pause here. Referring to secondary traditions that are, foundational for many communities as devil's inspiration is incredibly charged language.
It is.
Does the source material address the inevitable accusation of sectarianism or, intellectual isolationism that comes from such an absolute rejection?
It does, but it frames the issue not as sectarianism, but as the protection of intellectual purity. The danger isn't merely historical or social, it's cognitive. It's about how you think.
So the mechanism of corruption, this decorative speech, how does that work cognitively?
It's explained as falsehood being colorfully dressed up with deceptive half-truth. It appeals aesthetically, it sounds good, it feels traditional, but ultimately it distorts. It's a form of intellectual temptation.
Right.
The source argues this decorative speech acts like camouflage, allowing confusion and contradiction to sneak into the learner's understanding. And when that happens, it prevents the integrated holistic study that's mandated in Principle 1.
So the devils from humans and invisibles work together to make the distortion palatable, even beautiful.
Thereby making it impossible to follow the simple, straight paths of the primary text.
Precisely. And this ties directly back to the actionable direction that's giving to the reader in verse 68, which we touched on in the intro.
All right, turn away.
When the reader sees those who engage in mocking our messages, they have to turn away from them until they move on to a different hadith. The source interprets mocking here not just as explicit ridicule.
Like making fun of it?
Right. But as the very act of distorting or contradicting the messages of the Quran by using these external narratives.
Wow. So that makes the act of discussing the secondary tradition, the hadith, equivalent to participating in the distortion or the mockery of the core messages. The only defense is physical and intellectual removal.
It reinforces the idea that the Quranic messages have to be protected from any external distortion that elevates itself to a co-authority.
You can't have two judges. You can't. If you allow a commentary to dilute the message, you compromise the divine integrity. The ultimate safeguard against this is that definitive rhetorical question posed in verse 114. It really functions as the conclusion of this whole principle.
Say, shall I seek for judge other than God?
There it is.
That question completely seals off the external gate, doesn't it? If God is the judge and he has provided the book explained in detail, then no other supplemental authority is permissible. It establishes divine self-sufficiency and textual finality.
And once you accept that definitive rejection of external human authority, the next question immediately arises.
Which is?
If you can't rely on inherited tradition, and you can't rely on human commentaries, on what basis do you confirm truth? Simple faith isn't enough when you're faced with intellectual complexity.
Right.
And this is the logical bridge to Section 3, the call for critical thinking and scientific inquiry.
This is Core Guideline 3, and it's arguably the most radical demand presented in the source material, the use of scientific data and inductive logic rather than just blind following. This places the text directly into the realm of empirical verification and analysis.
It demands the learner adopt a rigorous, verifiable intellectual standard. And it starts, very powerfully, with a warning against the default human tendency toward mass consensus. We see this explicit caution in verse 116.
If you obey the majority of those on earth, they will lead you away from the divine path.
Just think about that.
That is a staggering claim in any cultural context, but especially within a religious framework where consensus, often called ijma, frequently plays a major role in establishing legitimacy. The source material is claiming the majority is not merely wrong, but actively dangerous to the pursuit of truth. Why? Why is the majority so reliably corrosive?
Well, the reason given for this deviation is intellectual laziness. The deviation happens because the majority follow conjecture, and that is because they only guess. That's from verse 116. The majority operates on zan guesswork, assumption, speculation, not ilm, which is knowledge. And knowledge requires verification.
So they're comfortable following inherited traditions because it's easy, not because it's factually sound.
Exactly. The danger of the majority is that they are not applying principle 2, which is rejecting human authority,
Right.
or principle 1, studying the whole. And instead they're just relying on simple guesswork disguised as popular opinion.
So the required antidote, then, must be a methodology of inquiry.
It has to be.
Yeah.
The source emphasizes that the learner must personally question, analyze, and verify. You cannot just accept ready-made premises mechanically deduced by others. This is a mandate for intellectual independence.
Okay, let's get into the technical aspect of this, because the source demands the persistent use of inductive logic and informed reasoning, founded on sensory data and scientific information. What does it mean to apply inductive logic and sensory data to a spiritual text like the Quran? I mean, does the source imply the reader has to be a full-time scientist?
No, not necessarily a full-time scientist, but the reader must adopt a scientific mindset.
Okay.
Inductive logic is the process of moving from specific, observable facts, your sensory data, to form broader, general principles. This is in sharp contrast with deductive reasoning, which starts from an inherited, pre-approved general principle, like a hadith or a theological assumption, and then tries to fit all the facts into it.
Okay, so the application is methodological. Instead of taking an external assumption about, say, cosmology and trying to force the Quran to fit it, you have to use observable, verifiable, data scientific knowledge to help interpret the vast, non-specific statements about the universe that you find in the text.
You must use verifiable facts to inform the interpretation.
And that avoids conjecture.
That's how you avoid conjecture. Exactly. The text is framed as demanding an alignment between revelation and reality. If God's signs are evident in the natural world, then the study of the natural world, which is science, is a form of worshiping and recognizing God.
So to reject science.
To reject scientific inquiry or sensory data is to rely on speculation and therefore to fall right into the trap of conjecture described in verse 116.
This connects beautifully back to the verse we noted earlier, 6.80. My sustainer encompasses all things with knowledge. Will you not then reflect?
Right.
Seen through this lens, that verse isn't just a suggestion for some quiet contemplation. It's a direct injunction for rigorous, reasoned thought and analysis that uses knowledge ilm as its basis.
It is a profound call to intellectual responsibility. If God's attributes are encompassing knowledge, then the seeker must pursue knowledge, not conjecture, to truly recognize the divine. The entire methodology is structured to integrate rational thought and revealed truth, using knowledge as the bridge and science as the tool for verification.
Yeah.
This is what prevents the learner from relying on the popular guesses of the majority.
So if the first three principles establish the methodology,
Holistic.
self-contained, and the intellect,
Logic.
then the fourth principle has to define the content. What is all this intellectual effort supposed to reveal? This brings us to section 4, the central message, upholding the awareness of oneness.
This is core guideline 4. Always uphold the focal point, which is the awareness of oneness. The source material claims that when you strip away the pollution of decorative speech from principle 2 and the distraction of the majority from principle 3, the original message is delivered by all true messengers, all sages, all visionaries. They are remarkably simple and similar in their essence.
And what does that original simple essence look like in practice?
The source lists the practical manifestations, things like kindness, justice, pluralism, tolerance, cooperation.
And crucially, it says these are achieved through an endless search for knowledge.
Right, connecting back to principle 3. These virtues are not static commands. They are the continuous, evolving output of understanding the unity of the divine.
And the source material organizes this core awareness into 4 specific interconnected concepts of oneness. This seems like the ultimate synthesis point.
They are the pillars of the simple message. They are the oneness of the divine, the oneness of humans, the oneness of life, and the oneness of the universe.
All interconnected.
All of them. The argument is that all genuine prophetic messages, historical and present, are derivatives of and revolve around these four concepts. If you violate one, you violate the root principle of divine oneness.
Let's focus on the primary driver here, the oneness of the divine, the central declaration of monotheism, the Shahada. The source material insists that this declaration isn't just a theological statement. It's an active mandate that inherently demands both knowledge and justice. How does monotheism demand justice?
Well, it creates a non-negotiable standard. If there is only one ultimate authority, then that authority is the single source of truth and fairness. To declare God's oneness is to commit yourself to the pursuit of truth, which is knowledge, and the upholding of fairness, which is justice, on earth.
Because these are the essential attributes of the one God.
Exactly. Any deviation from knowledge or justice is, functionally, a deviation from oneness because you're introducing distortion or partiality into the system.
This link is solidified in verse 115 more. The word of your sustainer has been completed with truth and justice. There is no changing in his words. The completion and the immutability of the divine word are defined by its foundation in these two practical, verifiable standards.
And that framework reinforces the fundamental directive laid out in verse 106.
Which is?
Follow what has been revealed unto you from your sustainer. There is no God but he, and turn away from those who set up associates.
So if you uphold this oneness, the only God, then you have to uphold truth and justice as well.
You have to. The second you fail at truth, by relying on conjecture, or you fail at justice, by creating arbitrary rules, you have essentially failed to uphold the oneness principle in practice.
This clear, simple, foundational, core oneness demanding knowledge and justice then sets the stage for the final guideline. And this last principle deals with the inevitable historical corruption of that beautiful simplicity. It demonstrates what happens when the first four rules are broken. We move to section 5, decomplicating directives. Rejecting man-made rules.
Core Guideline 5. Never complicate the simple divine directives with man-made rules and prohibitions. This principle serves as the ultimate practical defense for the learner against institutional corruption.
Right.
It addresses the historical reality of what happens when external authorities from Principle 2 and conjecture from Principle 3 are allowed to pollute the holistic message of Principle 1 and dilute the core of oneness from Principle 4.
The source material describes this as a historical process where the originate prophetic messages were badly polluted throughout the ages. What were the mechanisms of this pollution?
Well, the pollution was driven by add-ons and misinterpretations motivated by powerful socioeconomic, political, and psychotheological pressures.
So power.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Human power structures, ruling classes, clerics, dogmatists, they recognized the power of the simple message, and they began co-opting it to maintain control or to profit. And they did this by generating layer upon layer of complexity.
And the source material argues that these ruling classes and clergymen, primarily through the fabrication of secondary sources.
The hadiths we discussed earlier.
Right, that they deliberately transmuted the original message.
Yes, they transformed the divine system of eternal Islam, which the source defines as the true, simple, tolerant, one moral law, or deen, into what the source calls an intolerant, irrational theofiction.
A theofiction.
This transformation is the result of ignoring the self-sufficiency of the text and prioritizing human authority.
That phrase, intolerant, irrational theofiction, is extremely loaded. What are the specific accumulated components of this fiction that the source details?
They're listed as the antithesis of the simple deen. They include widespread superstitions, collections of, silly rituals that lack spiritual substance, arbitrary taboos, frivolous rules that distract from the major moral commands, absurd doctrines, numerous, often contradictory prohibitions and obligations, and perhaps most damagingly, intellectual slavery and wishful thinking. The opium of the masses.
Intellectual slavery. That's where the failure of Principle 3, critical thinking, really surfaces. If you don't use inductive logic, you are mentally enslaved to the rules imposed by others.
Exactly. The source suggests the complexity is the instrument of control. By layering hundreds of non-divine rules, the ruling classes can manage people's lives and prevent them from returning to the simple, emancipatory moral core of oneness.
And the condemnation of the people who import these rules is severe, isn't it? The text brands those who import fabricated injunctions and undue restrictions in God's name as falsifiers, aggressors, and even idol worshippers.
It does.
It elevates the creation of man-made rules to the level of idolatry.
It does. Because fabricating rules essentially means giving yourself the authority that belongs only to the sustainer. It is the failure of the oneness principle in practice. It sets up associates with God by granting human beings, or human traditions, the power of legislation.
And this condemnation leads to the ultimate practical defense mechanism provided for the reader in this passage, the call for verifiable proof against any prohibition.
It's the final, actionable command that empowers the learner against complication. If someone imposes a prohibition on you or demands a complex ritual, the instruction in verse 150 is to challenge it directly. Say, bring your witnesses who bear witness that God has forbidden this.
That is the ultimate tool against theofiction. If you cannot provide direct, divine, internal, textual witness that God mandated this specific prohibition, then the prohibition is intellectually and spiritually nullified.
Regardless of how popular or traditional it is.
It doesn't matter.
This command forces every claimant to external rules back to Principle 2, the sole authority of the primary text, and Principle 3, the demand for knowledge and verifiable proof, not conjecture.
And the final warning, closing out the passage, reinforces this absolute stance.
You are warned not to bear witness with those who lie about the messages or follow the desires of those who make equals with their sustainer. You must avoid complicity in the fabrication of divine law.
That perfectly ties together the entire self-contained study guide. We have the foundational methodology, the authority structure, the intellectual process, the core content, and the practical application for defending the message against historical corruption. I mean, this framework is truly comprehensive.
It is an integrated roadmap for the learner, extracted directly from Surah An'am.
So let's quickly consolidate this journey for our listener. The source material, through its deep dive into Surah An'am, provides 5 essential guidelines.
Right. First, you have the methodological standard, holistic study, seeing the text as the integrated whole, where verses explain each other, and recognizing that failure to acknowledge the end means failure to acknowledge coherence.
Second, the authority structure, rejecting hadiths as authority. You have to view external human commentaries as decorative speech and illegitimate co-judges that lead to division and intellectual delusion.
Third, the intellectual standard, using scientific logic. This means rejecting blind following and conjecture, which is just the guesswork of the majority, in favor of inductive reasoning based on verifiable data and knowledge.
Fourth, the central focal point, upholding oneness. Recognizing that core message that demands knowledge and justice and defining the 4 interconnected concepts of oneness, divine, human, life, and universe.
And finally, the practical defense mechanism, avoiding man-made complications. You challenge all added rules and prohibitions with a demand for divine proof, and by doing that, you dismantle the intolerant, irrational theofiction.
This framework, delivered through the source material, offers a clear and, well, a challenging structure for any learner approaching this text. It respects your time by eliminating centuries of accumulated commentary, but it simultaneously increases the burden of intellectual work placed squarely on your shoulders. You have to be your own judge.
And that intense personal responsibility leads us back to the most provocative idea presented in this entire deep dive.
Which is?
If the greatest challenge to understanding a foundational text is not its inherent complexity, but the sheer weight of inherited popular opinion, the majority that you have to overcome.
And if, as verse 116 warns, the majority of those on earth will actively lead you away from the divine path, if consensus is the primary engine of intellectual deviation, what does that imply about the necessary intellectual solitude, or the courage required to stand against consensus for true individual reflection and the acquisition of genuine, verifiable knowledge?
What cost must the learner be prepared to pay to separate verifiable truth from the comfortable guesses of the crowd?
That is a question that demands continuous reflection.